Nothing mixes with freedom quite like law enforcement. In the 21st century, if something goes wrong, the common response is to dial 911 to summon the police, but this hasn't always been the case. The police officer today is the primary tool used by modern democratic states to enforce laws and maintain public order in their territory. The United States applies this concept very heavily, using police to resolve everything from active shooters to bumps in the night. But this has led to several problems with regards to racial discrimination, unnecessary safety risks to officers and the public, and brutality. Today we're going into the past, present, and potential future of public safety in the United States. The police officer as we know them today is a concept that has changed significantly throughout history, and every pre-modern culture has handled the practice of public safety differently.
Stop right there, criminal scum!
Generally speaking, pre-modern police forces would be composed in one of two ways. The first way was a medium-sized paramilitary force detached from the army, which would handle public security, conduct nighttime patrols, and augment the military during civil disturbances, while investigation and prosecution would be left to civilians or government officials. Training for these forces was often comparable to reserve soldiers with limited legal education. The second way was where a small group of highly educated officers would conduct all aspects of law enforcement, including significant portions of the judicial process, from handling testimony to rendering punishments for crimes. Public security, meanwhile, would be handled by private guards or the army. Training for these officers was very high, with officers often expected to know the law almost word for word. Both of these methods would vary significantly by region and change over time. There were also political machinations to consider as governments maintained power through the monopoly on violence, and that would see police forces dissolved or reorganized depending on their allegiance and the needs of the ruling class. Policing would evolve, however, with the advent of colonialism, with key developments occurring in the American colonies. In the early days of the American colonies, law enforcement was based in civilian participation, with sheriffs and constables forming and leading posses of civilian volunteers, as well as civilians organizing themselves into watch groups and night patrols. This was the development of the British hue and cry system, which tasked civilians with stopping anyone seen committing a crime, as well as rendering the criminal to jail themselves. The posse system was managed by a both volunteer and conscripted service under the power of posse comitatus, a legal function which empowered sheriffs and other law enforcement officers to summon and deputize citizens within their jurisdictions to enforce the law as a posse. This is shown as a heroic action in Wild West movies, with the sheriff rallying the people of the town to fight the bad guys, with notable real-world cases in the 1860s serving as commonly cited positive examples. In the American South, however, these powers were used to organize slave patrols aimed at locating escaped enslaved people and preventing slave rebellions. After the abolition of slavery, the powers of posse comitatus were also used by sheriffs to deputize racist mobs and enabled lynchings. This practice then re-emerged in the 60s when sheriffs deputized racist mobs to resist integration. As of today, posse comitatus is still in effect in all U.S. states that have not expressly abolished it, but its use has declined with the advent of new models of policing. The transition from civilian volunteers to uniformed police stemmed from a variety of sources, with both the existing posse comitatus system and the newly developed British model of policing playing major roles in the development of American policing from the 1830s onward. Posses evolved with the times, with one of the largest slave patrols in the South, the Charleston Garden Watch, adopting a paramilitary structure with uniforms, ranks, and a stated focus of crime prevention, despite its duties focused entirely on maintaining the institution of slavery. While the unit would end with the abolition of slavery, the tactics and doctrine of the Charleston Garden Watch and slave patrols broadly would be noted and employed by the Ku Klux Klan and racist sheriffs in the later 1800s. Meanwhile, in the UK, the British model of policing was developed in the 1830s in response to rampant crime in London, built around the concept of policing by consent. This model stipulated that the British policing's success was contingent on the consent of the governed, officers' accountability to the public, and restraint against the use of force unless absolutely necessary. This model also stipulated that police agencies should be comprised of highly trained, full-time officers, and that the effectiveness of police would be measured by the absence of crime, not by the volume of arrests or other police activity. This model was first implemented in London with the Metropolitan Police and then expanded both in the UK and abroad. The first publicly funded full-time police agencies based on the British model began popping up in large cities like New York and Philadelphia in the mid-1800s. However, the majority of U.S. police agencies chose to adopt the form of the British model while neglecting the functions, focusing on uniformity and command discipline with training standards and use of force restrictions falling by the wayside. The abolition of slavery also did little to quell institutional racism in the legal system, with loose use of force restrictions, limited training, and a swarm of racist laws throwing open the door for police violence against people of color. Over time, more and more police agencies adopted this model. Some progressive police chiefs, like O.W. Wilson in California, established boards to govern police actions and reduce brutality. But in most cases, police departments remained largely autocratic, with chiefs dictating doctrine from above and often neglecting to update themselves with the latest public safety research or input from democratic institutions. Over time, sheriffs in the North and South also saw this process transpiring and reduced the use of posses in favor of full-time officers. Today, most sheriffs operate as elected officials with their own departments, which are organized very similarly to their police counterparts, with standard ranks, uniforms, and equipment. There are also cases where a sheriff's department exists in the same jurisdiction as a police department, and sheriff's deputies are assigned to execute warrants and handle security for courts and other government property, such as impound lots. Most law enforcement officers still have the power to invoke posse comitatus, but the practice has been phased out in all but a few cases. American police departments in the 21st century use standard sets of ranks, uniforms, and command structure, and have universal procedures for the most basic law enforcement duties, but equipment and doctrine varies based on local law and department preference. Training requirements are not standardized, with departments exercising their own discretion. While 46 out of 50 states have a standard certification system of some kind, what exactly is required varies widely, and according to a report by the Institute for Criminal Justice Training Reform, the United States on average has very low police training requirements, coming in at around 21 weeks, with countries at similar levels including Iraq, Afghanistan, and Papua New Guinea. This pales in comparison to police in economically comparable countries like Sweden or Finland. According to a report by the Department of Justice Office of Justice Programs, Swedish police training takes approximately 3 years. This is where the problems behind American policing are made apparent in the modern day. The first major issue is training. According to a Bureau of Justice Statistics report, American police officers suffer from a highly condensed training curriculum compared to their European contemporaries. And within that curriculum, the subject material is heavily focused on firearms training compared to other skills required of a peace officer. The vast majority of time, aside from day-to-day procedures like report writing, investigations, and patrol routines, is spent on firearms training. While these skills are important in some emergencies, less training time is spent on social psychology or conflict resolution, leaving officers under-equipped to prevent situations from escalating to violence or manage situations that do not require deadly force, such as attempted suicides or mental health crises. This is where the police curriculum suffers the most, as noted by the OJP report, whereas Swedish police are required to complete 3 years of training, with the final 20 weeks spent on a battery of tests to ensure prospective officers will treat their badge as a symbol of public trust, not a bludgeon of authority. Swedish officers are also given roughly 300 hours of training in social science and psychology compared to the U.S. officers less than 200. They also have a higher amount of training on non-lethal techniques than the U.S. counterparts. Sweden is not a utopia and has several institutional problems, but their training and tactics based on the British model have attained better outcomes for the public they police, with lower death rates compared to their American counterparts. They are also used only in certain calls and are not the first tool when an emergency transpires, which we'll get into later. The next key problem is the demographic imbalance in enforcement, which has been found to slant heavily against African Americans. A study of 100 million traffic stops conducted by Nature found that African Americans are more likely to be pulled over in traffic stops than white or Hispanic drivers during the daytime, with the amount of African American drivers stopped dropping drastically once night falls. This is important to note because it suggests that, all circumstances being equal, African Americans are more likely to be pulled over based solely on the color of their skin and not other factors. Police officers' lackluster training also presents more of an issue when interactions escalate, as African Americans are at greater risk of being killed by police officers than other racial groups in these situations. A Columbia Law study of roughly 4,000 police killings found that even when there are no obvious indicators the use of force is reasonable, African American suspects are twice as likely to be killed by officers than non-black suspects. They also found that mental health-centered police training did not reduce the racial disparity in shootings, suggesting that there is an implicit bias in the decision-making of police officers. As mentioned earlier, O.W. Wilson was ahead of the game with regard to police sports in the early 1920s, But police boards should not only serve to direct the behavior of police officers, but have additional civilian counterparts created to monitor and arbitrate the use of force by police officers, circumventing the notorious blue wall of silence that includes internal police investigations. Body cameras should also be standard and mandatory, with backups maintained of all footage and all public interactions recorded. More attention should be paid overall to minimizing the use of force to only when it is absolutely necessary, as well as countering the cultural idea of the warrior cop, which encourages hyper-militarization of police forces, even though a study by Jonathan Mumolo from Princeton found that militarization fails to decrease crime and degrades the reputation of the police, although it should be self-evident that looking like an occupying army will degrade public reputation. A lot of arguments made today have been based on Sweden's model compared to the United States, but Sweden uses its police force fundamentally differently than the United States. For direct calls, police responders are often substituted for psychiatrists and social workers in appropriate situations that do not require lethal force, which frees up additional officers to handle serious threats while leaving non-threatening situations to appropriate personnel. Sweden also has a much more robust social safety net, with free health care and free college contributing to a significantly higher standard of living and lower propensity for crime, preventing crime before it can start. There is no one answer to the question of public safety, but it is clear that the institution of policing has a checkered past and an unsustainable present. Serious changes need to create a future where all members of the public are protected equally, and the armed police officer is not the best tool or the only tool for the job. There is also a robust philosophical debate whether we should have police at all, with police abolitionists citing different models for community safety without the use of an armed police force, which is an ongoing conversation that merits its own video and would see a great deal of development required to achieve. The practice of policing in society has evolved significantly over time, and we still have a long way to go, but one thing is certain: we can't achieve a better future by remaining stuck in the past.